Donald Trump and his Putin pivot are going to cost the United States, and in particular the US arms industry, hundreds of billions of dollars in the next few years, and ultimately trillions of dollars over the next 1 to 2 decades. Привit, my name is Connor Klein, and welcome to Geopolitics with Connor Klein, with a focus on the Russo-Ukrainian war. So I've been living in Ukraine for many years, speak Ukrainian and Russian. I'm an expert in international relations, have an academic background in the field with a specialization on this region, and I'm here to give you a little bit more unique and insightful perspective on the happenings of the Russo-Ukrainian war. So let's get into it. Let me read to you from the US State Department, its report from 2024. They saw a 29% increase in its military equipment sales to foreign governments, reaching a total of $318.7 billion for the year. So that's how much the US made from foreign arms sales. Let me take 3 examples to illustrate. In 2024, there was $23 billion for F-16 jets and aircraft upgrades to Turkey, that's Turkey. $18.8 billion for F-15 fighter jets to Israel, and $2.5 billion for M1A2 Abrams tanks to Romania. Now, 2 out of those 3 allies of the US are in NATO. That would be Turkey and Romania. Israel obviously is very closely allied with the United States. Now think about it. If you are the leader of an ally of the United States, after the last few weeks in which we've had the Munich Security Conference, a big diplomatic spat between Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump, an attempt by US to extract a neo-colonial minerals deal out of Ukraine in exchange for more or less nothing, and then we had the dressing down or shouting match. Well, it was just one side shouting at Volodymyr Zelensky, completely disgraceful breach of diplomatic decorum by the United States with an ally last Friday. And since then, the US has cut off military aid to Ukraine. Previously, because they disbanded USAID, they actually shut down the humanitarian aid to Ukraine as well. And now they are, as of yesterday, refusing to share intel with the Ukrainians. So that renders a lot of their equipment maybe not completely ineffective, but pretty much. Now, if you are one of these foreign leaders and you're an ally, let's take an ally, a strong ally, you're in NATO. So let's take Turkey and Romania, in particular Romania. Do you think it would be a smart move to continue to buy US military equipment going forward when, at the whim every 4 years of the US public, they can elect a president that is going to change the orientation of US foreign policy away from its allies. Well, Romania wasn't an ally back in the day because it was part of the Warsaw Pact, but the transatlantic partnership between Germany, France, United Kingdom, and the US has been going on since the end of World War II, so over 80 years, and definitely since 2004 when we had countries that were previously in the Warsaw Pact join en masse NATO, like Poland, the 3 Baltic states. So it's over 20 years. If every 4 years there can be a president in power that's going to upend that and suddenly pivot away towards the interests of the aggressor and your main security threat, which is Russia and Vladimir Putin, do you want to be buying military equipment from the US when it can be shut off or disabled because they decide that they want to reward the aggressor, your main adversary, for their own interests, or it's not even clear to me why that would be in the interests of the US, you would have to be rather reckless to continue dependent on America. In fact, you would be well advised to stop buying any new equipment from the US and focus on other places to buy from, and presumably ones that you're more closely allied with. So obviously those 3 examples I gave, 2 were NATO allies, but even Israel, maybe the next Democratic president, for example, is not so pro-Israel. Maybe there's complete change, who knows? Do the Israelis want to be dependent on US military equipment that could be basically disabled, or you don't get your updates, you don't get your software updates, and suddenly you can't use them? And maybe they decide to flip and start supporting your adversary. In this case, I guess it would be Hamas or Hezbollah or Iran or someone like that. It seems unthinkable now, but it seemed pretty unthinkable that a US president is going to support Vladimir Putin, a Russian dictator, over their liberal democratic allies in Europe. But that's what we've been seeing. It all started, for me at least, in my analysis, with the Munich Security Conference and J.D. Vance's speech, where he described European societies as the main threat to Europe and not China and Russia. This was a major departure from the type of speech that normally at this conference would have been given. It would have emphasized the bonds of the NATO alliance, but he did the opposite. He then basically campaigned for the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, which is a pro-Kremlin political party in Germany, a week before the German parliamentary elections. Elon Musk, who plays a big role in the current US administration, also has been campaigning for the AfD. And that continued with suddenly this big diplomatic spat between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, when Zelensky refused to sign a neo-colonial resource diktat from the Trump administration. Eventually, they came to an agreement about a draft. I reviewed it as a former lawyer, EU lawyer, here on my channel. It was a bit of a nothing burger, to quote a phrase that Donald Trump's used in the past. It was basically an agreement to reconstruct Ukraine using new extraction resources. So who knows if they're even there in the future. Maybe there aren't so many interesting or extractable or profitably extractable resources. But there was no security guarantee being provided by the US, and Donald Trump just refuses to give one, presumably because, when it comes down to it, if Russia were to break a ceasefire with Ukraine, that if he manages to negotiate one, then the US is not going to do anything. That is the problem. And his trust me bro insistence that Putin wouldn't invade while he's president, well, in 4 years, according to the US Constitution, Donald Trump cannot be president. And in any case, as Volodymyr Zelensky pointed out in that huge argument played out in front of the cameras on Friday in the Oval Office, Putin broke lots of ceasefires when Donald Trump was actually president in his first term. So that is not a compelling argument whatsoever. So again, think about it from the point of view of countries that buy a lot of US military equipment. Like if you're Poland, if you're the 3 Baltic states, I got my Latvian top on here. Can be Estonia, can be Lithuania. Can also be Romania, as we've seen with that example. They will be well advised to turn to each other and other EU allies and perhaps the United Kingdom, even though they left with Brexit, to look for new weapon supplies going forward and not to rely on the US, because the US, basically with Donald Trump, the negotiation, if you want to call it, but that strategy is to try to force Ukraine to capitulate and agree to Russia's basically surrender terms. Since Donald Trump has started giving up all these bargaining chips before they even start negotiations, like no NATO membership for Ukraine, they have to concede territory to Russia. He's now cut off the financial and military aid to Ukraine, and even the intelligence sharing to put them in a weaker position on the battlefield. Well, we've had an impasse more or less for the last 2 years where Russia has lost a huge amount of resources, and it's not clear that Russia can win. It's actually pretty clear, I would argue the opposite. They cannot win militarily if the way they've been going. They don't have a strategy without Donald Trump cutting off this kind of support. Even then, I still doubt that Russia can actually win on the battlefield, at least in the short to medium term. So we see all these steps been taken, and what has that are against Ukraine's position by their erstwhile ally, the United States. And what has Russia done in response? Have they conceded anything? Absolutely not. They've actually done the opposite. They've increased their demands. Of course, that's what they would do, because now Donald Trump is effectively strengthening their position on the battlefield and diplomatically. So again, think about it from the position of Romania, Estonia. They would be well advised to not depend on the US going forward, even if they believe that maybe in 4 years there will be a new US president. Because who knows, in 8 years, maybe it flips back again. These US presidential elections over the last while have been going from Democratic Party to Republican Party and back again, Donald Trump to obviously Joe Biden. And before that, we had Barack Obama. So that is the situation. It is worth $300 billion per year. The different NATO allies are now increasing their defense spending, as they've been doing since the 2022 invasion. They've actually been doing it slowly since the 2014 Russian invasion of Ukraine, when this Russo-Ukrainian war started. So there is literally trillions of dollars worth of arms sales going forward over the next 5, 10, 20 years that almost certainly the US is going to miss out on. And that would mean more money to obviously subsidize those tax cuts that Donald Trump wants to introduce. And more importantly, jobs in particular, maybe blue-collar jobs, we would call them, in a lot of states that actually voted for Donald Trump. I mean, there was this incident when Volodymyr Zelensky, during the US presidential campaign between Harris and Trump, he went to a munitions factory in Pennsylvania, and the Trump team went apoplectic, saying he's campaigning for Kamala Harris by even going there. What were they so scared of? The fact that maybe some of Trump's base in this key state might realize that supporting Ukraine is actually in their own personal financial interest, since it's creating jobs and bringing money to the US. A lot of that, I'm going to put air quotes 350 billion, because it's not 350 billion that Donald Trump keeps repeating. It's probably around 100 to 150 billion US dollars. Much of it actually was being spent in the US producing new stocks of armaments for the US military, and then they were sending the old stuff that was going to go obsolete anyways to Ukraine, which has a certain amount of value and is definitely very useful for the Ukrainians, but they were not giving them pallets full of money and sending it over whatsoever. It was debatable whether it was actually really costing the US that much, because Joe Biden had talked a big game. He had appropriated a lot of money for the Ukraine to help Ukraine, but they hadn't actually spent a large amount of that money. Actually, what they spent was not relatively little, did make a difference, and currently it's estimated that the US supports the Ukrainian military to 30 to 40% of its military materiel. So they're going to obviously have to operate on the basis that they're going to lose that at this point, unless they're willing to capitulate in some shape or form, which is unlikely. Last point to think about, also Donald Trump in the last few weeks and his administration has started talking about how Zelensky is a dictator, that he needs to have elections. And now they're saying they won't do business with him. He needs to either be replaced. Do you want to be a political leader that has to deal with an arms supplier that basically wants you removed when you will not capitulate to their diktat in negotiations for your resources? Like Romania, for example, has a certain amount of mining, as I know. And most importantly, when you've already been attacked and you're resisting this aggression pretty successfully, especially compared to the expectations 3 years ago, that suddenly they want to get rid of you to put in a more pliant political leader? Absolutely not. No sensible leader is going to want to be even in an alliance with the US if this continues. I would say it's basically irrevocable, the damage that's been done, because it's already been done, and now every single ally of the US has to factor that in. It's also undermining the Article 5 protections, because now is that Article 5 protection of the NATO treaty really credible, with Donald Trump having basically yanked US foreign policy and done a 180 and pivoted towards helping Putin? Maybe he feels he's going to get something in return. Can't imagine if that would replace the amount of money that they're going to lose from these arms sales. And I can't imagine they'd actually be able to sell them directly to Russia. Maybe, let's see. It is a crazy change and a watershed in US foreign policy. So if he's willing to do that, would you trust Donald Trump as a political leader for Article 5 protection if you are a country, say, in the Baltic states? I would say absolutely not if you are sensible at this point. It is a tragedy, but this is the new reality. And because these countries buy into basically a framework, they basically buy the US arms in part because they're in an alliance and they can depend on the US to supply all these updates and have their back, in particular with the nuclear deterrent that's provided by the US for a lot of these countries that don't have nuclear weapons, like Poland, like the Baltic states, like Romania, France and well, Germany doesn't have nuclear weapons, but France and UK do have nuclear weapons as European powers. So they buy into that entire framework. And now that the deterrence factor and credibility of Article 5 has basically been called into question, also during the campaign trail, Donald Trump infamously stated that he would encourage Russia to attack certain countries if he felt they weren't spending enough on defense. 100% we're going to see a dramatic increase from these European allies, erstwhile allies of the United States, on their military spending. It's going to be worth trillions over the next decade or so, and it is not going to go to the US. Almost certainly we will probably see a European arms industry that will now absolutely blossom. We've seen in the stock prices of European arms manufacturers over the last few days, they have skyrocketed because that is where the smart money is going to go, because now countries will have to no longer buy US weapons like they felt they should, because US providing the security guarantee and being a strong ally for many decades. And they're going to have to become more self-sufficient. Personally, I've always been in favor of that. I never liked the fact that the European allies of the US depended on the US or put themselves in a weak position, because they still have to pay for it, maybe not in terms of tribute, but they're buying all these weapons that they could have produced themselves ultimately and created jobs in Europe. And now they find out that Article 5 isn't very credible. And in fact, the current US administration is determined to throw Ukraine, an ally of the US, to the wolves, basically, and capitulate, trying to force the capitulation of Ukraine to Russia. And that bodes very badly for defense across the continent, and in particular US arms sales. So I'm going to leave it at that for today's video. Put your comments down below in the description. I'm going to stay optimistic from the Ukrainian point of view that even without US materiel, Ukraine can still resist successfully, and the war will probably go on for many more years, sadly, and many more people will die as a result of this. But I still believe that there is a pathway to Ukrainian success in this war. So, Slava Ukraini, do peremоги.